CM from Fort Williams. It's good to be able to share again with the scripture, sharing the scripture with you again this morning. I was reading an article earlier last week, and it was saying that 90% of the news that we are receiving right now, or that most people are looking at right now, is framed negatively. Things like crashing economies and COVID virus death, increasing numbers, hospitals being overrun, medical devices not having a sufficient number of medical devices. And so we are constantly, currently being bombarded by negative news. And yet I love what Paul does here in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. He wants to talk about something rather than negative news. He wants to talk about good news. Notice what it says in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." Notice how he starts off. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I want to talk about the gospel. Now that word gospel, as many of you already know, is the word for good news in the Greek language. And Paul says, I want to talk about some good news right now, and I'm not ashamed to talk about it. You see, during Paul's day, and certainly when he was talking to the church at Rome, there was plenty of negative news around as well, even life-threatening news for many of the Christians. And Paul says, what better thing to talk about than to talk about the good news? Why is it good news? Look at what he says here. He says, I'm not ashamed to talk about the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation. And so even in the midst of all of this mess and chaos, he says, I want to talk about the power of God to salvation. And that is good news. Wouldn't it be great, I was thinking this week, wouldn't it be great if we just heard from the news, the news came in and we all got on our feeds here on Facebook and on the news that we watch on a daily basis. Cure for coronavirus. No more deaths. Economies bounce back. And that we were just bombarded with good news. Wouldn't that be great to hear? Well, in that sense, it is an important thing to constantly be reminded of the power of God to salvation. That is great news, that we would look into the pages of Scripture and remember the great news that is given to us in Scripture, that there is salvation for everyone who believes. And I wonder how much you have been focusing on this great news, or have you been consumed by the 90% of bad news that is around you? Secondly, how much are you sharing the good news with others? Listen, they are hearing bad news constantly. It is coming into their feeds and into their life, and yet you know the good news, the power of God unto salvation. And I know that many people are getting news fatigue right now, where they're just constantly hearing over and over this just dredge of horrible things that are going on in the world. And yet, we shouldn't be ashamed of the gospel, because it is good news. It is the perfect time to start sharing the good news of salvation. In fact, I was reading another article this week. The number one book that is being downloaded right now around the globe off the internet is the Bible. I think people are looking for something different than what they have been hearing. They are looking for a positive message. And listen, we have that positive message. Paul had that positive message in a very dark time, and he says, I want to talk about that good news. I want to talk about the gospel. Are you delighted in talking about the good news? I heard of a bicycle company this week. I read about them, and they were having problems as they were shipping out these bicycles. It was a company in Denmark, and they were having problems with damaged deliverables. And so many of the products were coming back and they were damaged, and so they were losing a great deal of money in delivering and mailing them out. And so they were debating, what do we do to make sure that these products aren't damaged in the mail? And the solution was simple. They simply changed the box. And on the box, they put a TV screen with a bicycle on it and put fragile. And everybody then who began to deliver the product thought that there was a TV in there. And all of a sudden, they weren't throwing the box around anymore, but they were dealing with it or handling it with care. Same product on the inside. The only thing was the box has changed. And I thought in some ways that's what we need to be doing right now. Listen, the world is probably not going to change overnight. The world isn't going to be healed overnight. But we need to put the box that says good news and the gospel. We need to change the message. We need to change the hope. And as we change the hope and change the message and change the box, our situation and how we handle our situation changes. I wonder what you are focusing on. I wonder what your box is right now. Is your box surrounded by the gospel and the good news and the hope that we find in Jesus? Is that what you're conveying to the world around you? I hope that maybe that could be the message that you have going forward. Remember, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is good news. It's the power of God to salvation. I hope that you share that power of God to salvation. I hope you share that good news this week. God bless.